She was 19 when the papers were signed. Papers that didn't bear her name, but sealed her future just the same. Her father's debts had piled high like the fences he'd never mended. Gambling, whiskey, and a bad hand in a worse saloon, that's what sold her name to a man she'd never met. They called him Elias Crow, the millionaire cowboy of Eden Hollow. A man of 50 with silver in his beard and mystery in his eyes. He owned land stretching as far as a rider could see, oil wells that hissed like serpents, and cattle that moved like storms across the plains. People said he'd bought more than land. He'd bought silence, too, and now he was buying a wife. Her name was Clara Mayfield, and the morning she left her home, she didn't cry. She stood on the wooden porch, her hands still red from scrubbing dishes she'd never eat from again. Her mother clung to her shawl, whispering prayers to a God who'd stopped answering long ago. The wagon came at dawn. Elias's men, silent, dressed in black dusters, their boots heavy on the dirt. They said nothing to her, only nodded toward the road. When Clara stepped into that wagon, the town's eyes followed her. Some pitied her, some envied her. Others whispered that she was lucky. Lucky to be chosen by a man of power, even if her soul didn't get a say. The road stretched dry and endless. The sun burned her cheeks raw. Hours passed before the land began to change. Fences grew taller, barns larger, men working the fields with precision like soldiers. This was Crow Ranch, and it breathed wealth the way others breathed air. At the center stood a white house, too perfect for dust, with windows that glimmered coldly under the noon light. She'd imagined meeting her husband at the gate, but Elias wasn't there. Only his foreman, a man named Reeves, greeted her. "Mr. Crow's expecting you tonight," he said, his voice flat as the horizon. "He don't take kindly to delays." Inside, the house smelled like cedar and secrets. Servants moved quietly, their eyes avoiding hers. A maid helped her into a wedding dress, simple but beautiful, and said under her breath, "Don't ask questions tonight. Whatever he gives you, just nod." Those words haunted her. As the sun sank behind the hills, Clara stood before Elias Crow for the first time. He was taller than she'd expected, his presence heavy, his eyes the color of smoke. The ceremony was brief, no church bells, no laughter, only vows exchanged in the grand parlor under a mounted bull skull. When the preacher left, Elias poured 2 glasses of bourbon. He handed her one but didn't drink his. Then he said, "Every bride deserves a wedding gift." He pulled a small iron key from his pocket, its surface blackened with age. "This opens a door in the cellar," he told her, his tone low and deliberate. "Behind that door lies everything that built this ranch. Everything people whisper about. It's yours now, if you can bear to see it." Clara froze, the key cold in her palm. "What's behind it?" she asked. Elias smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "The truth," he said, "and truth tends to silence more than lies ever could." That night, as thunder rolled beyond the hills, Clara held the key tight beneath her pillow. Outside, the town celebrated her wedding with lanterns and gossip. Inside, in the still dark of Crow Ranch, the girl who'd been sold as payment listened to the whispering wind through the floorboards and wondered what kind of man gave a secret as a gift and what kind of woman she'd have to become. To open that door. That night, Clara didn't sleep. The storm outside had quieted, but inside her chest, thunder still rumbled. The iron key lay on the table beside her bed, small, heavy, and cruelly alive. Every time she closed her eyes, she could almost hear it whispering. By dawn, curiosity had replaced fear. Elias had already left for the fields. She could see him from the window, a solitary figure on horseback, riding through the fog that clung to the valley. He didn't look back once. When the house grew silent, Clara rose. Her bare feet touched the cold floorboards as she followed the long corridor down toward the kitchen, then farther, to where the scent of earth and oil thickened. She found the cellar door near the back pantry, wooden, unremarkable, but with a small rusted lock that matched the size of her key. Her hands trembled as she slid the metal into place. The lock gave way with a soft click, like the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. The stairs creaked beneath her as she descended. The air grew damp, colder with every step. The lantern flame flickered, and the walls seemed to breathe with her. At the bottom, she found not a storage room, but a corridor carved into the earth itself. Wooden beams held the ceiling, and along the walls were old crates stamped with the Crow brand, the same brand burned into the hides of cattle all across the territory. But there were other symbols, too. Strange markings, names written in chalk, and one door at the end of the tunnel. It was made of iron, heavy, black, and humming faintly with the sound of dripping water beyond. Clara hesitated, her breath shallow. She touched the cold surface and whispered, "What are you hiding, Elias Crow?" Then she turned the handle. The lantern's light poured into the darkness beyond, revealing rows of wooden crosses. Dozens of them. Each stood planted in the damp soil, each marked with a name she didn't recognize, until she saw one that froze her blood. Thomas Mayfield. Her father. Clara dropped the lantern. The flame sputtered and died, leaving only the echo of her scream swallowed by the underground air. When she stumbled back, she tripped over a half-buried chest. Inside, papers, ledgers, receipts, names, all debts, all settled by Elias Crow. One page at the top bore her father's shaky signature, and the words, "In exchange for my daughter's hand." The ink bled like guilt. A sudden creak came from behind. Elias stood at the top of the stairs, a shadow framed by lantern light. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak. Just looked down, calm, unreadable. "I told you it was yours," he said softly. "The truth always belonged to you," Clara's voice broke. "You killed him." "No," Elias said, stepping closer. "I buried him. The town already killed him long before I did, with their loans, their greed, their laughter." He knelt beside the crosses and brushed the dirt from one of the names. "These were not victims, Clara. These were men who sold their souls for silver. I simply collected what was owed. And me?" she whispered. "What was I?" Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes held something she didn't expect. Sorrow. "You were the only debt I didn't want to collect." The cellar fell silent. The wind howled faintly through the cracks above, and in that stillness, Clara understood something. Elias Crow hadn't married her out of lust or vanity. He'd married her to protect a legacy built on blood, to keep his sins close enough that no one else could expose them. But now she knew. And knowledge in Eden Hollow was a dangerous thing. That night, when she returned to her room, the key still cold in her hand, Clara looked out the window at the sleeping town below, the people who had whispered about her marriage. They had no idea what lay buried under that perfect house, and she realized, with a chill running down her spine, that the wedding gift wasn't just meant to silence her. It was meant to silence everyone. The next morning, the sun rose over Eden Hollow like it always did, soft gold over still water, dust shimmering on the road. But for Clara, light had lost its warmth. She sat by the window, her hands clasped so tightly they turned white. Elias had left before dawn again. He didn't speak to her, didn't mention the cellar, didn't even look in her direction. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Down in the town, whispers were already spreading about how Elias Crow's young bride had gone pale as snow since her wedding night. About how the girl who once smiled at market stalls now avoided every mirror, and though no one dared say it aloud, they all wondered, what kind of wedding gift had she received that could drain the light from her eyes? That afternoon, Clara rode into town with the maid, Ruth, who'd served the Crows for years. She needed air and answers. The townsfolk greeted her with forced smiles. Hats tipped. Women curtsied. But their eyes followed her, full of curiosity that cut like knives. At the general store, old Mr. Dalton leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. "Miss Crow," he said, "you be careful riding out there alone. Strange things happen on that ranch. Always have." Clara's stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" He hesitated. "Men gone missing. Families leaving with no goodbyes. We stopped asking questions long ago. Safer that way." Then, softer still. "You didn't hear that from me." When she returned to the ranch that evening, Elias was waiting by the porch. He watched her dismount, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "You've been in town," he said. "Yes," she replied quietly. "People talk. They always do." He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Clara. The town doesn't care about truth. It never did. They only care about the comfort of their lies." She looked up at him, defiant now. "Then why keep them comfortable?" Elias's eyes darkened. "Because comfort keeps them quiet." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the glow of the lanterns, the night humming with crickets and unease. Over the next days, Clara noticed things she hadn't before. Workers who never looked her in the eye, servants who whispered prayers before entering the cellar corridor. And one evening, she caught Ruth burning old papers behind the barn. Ledgers, she realized, like the ones she'd found underground. When Clara confronted her, Ruth's hands trembled. "Don't, miss," she pleaded. "You don't understand. This town's built on crow money. The church, the school, even the doctor's house, all of it came from him. From what's buried down there." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Then they all know," Ruth nodded. "They've always known. That's why they keep quiet." That night, Clara went to the edge of the ranch, where the land dipped into the valley and the wind carried the faint sound of the town's church bell. She stood there for a long time, thinking about her father, about how he'd lost everything to the same man who now owned her name. She thought of the crosses underground, the names written in chalk, the quiet guilt of a town that chose not to see. And for the first time, she realized Elias Crow wasn't the only one with blood on his hands. Every person who had taken his money, every man who had stayed silent, every woman who'd whispered and turned away, they'd all accepted his gift too. The next morning, Clara came down to breakfast dressed in white, the same dress she'd worn on her wedding day. Elias looked up from his coffee, brow furrowing. "You planning to run or to haunt me?" "Neither," she said, steady as stone. "I'm planning to open that door again." He set his cup down. "You already saw enough." "Not enough," she said. "Not until the whole town sees it." Elias stared at her for a long time. Then a smile, faint, almost sad, touched his lips. "You think the town deserves the truth," he said. "But the truth will bury them faster than it ever buried me." "Then let it," Clara whispered. "Let the truth do what you couldn't." And in that moment, Elias Crow, the man who had built his empire on silence, saw something in the girl he'd once bought, a fire he couldn't control, because she no longer belonged to him. She belonged to the truth. By the fourth morning, the air in Eden Hollow felt heavier, as if the dust itself carried secrets waiting to be stirred. Clara stood on the porch of Crow Ranch, looking down at the sleeping town below. The same town that had whispered her name in envy, then in pity, then in fear. But soon it would whisper something else. Ruth begged her not to go. "Miss Clara, please. You don't know what you're stirring. The town's not ready for that kind of truth." Clara's eyes were steady. "They've had years to be ready. They just never chose to be," she rode alone. The horse's hooves struck the earth with a rhythm that echoed her heartbeat, steady, defiant. As she reached Main Street, heads turned. Men stopped their wagons. Women froze mid-step. She dismounted in front of the church, the tallest building in Eden Hollow, and climbed the steps. From her saddlebag, she pulled the ledger she'd taken from the cellar, the one bearing her father's signature, and dozens of others. She held it high for all to see. "This town was built on stolen lives," she cried, her voice cutting through the still air. "Every dollar that built your homes, your schools, your pretty church walls, it all came from the graves under Crow Ranch." A murmur spread through the crowd like wildfire. Old Mr. Dalton stumbled forward. "You don't know what you're saying, girl." Clara turned to him, her eyes burning. "I do, you all do. You just pretended not to." The sheriff stepped from the crowd then, a broad man with tired eyes and a badge that gleamed in the sun. "Mrs. Crow," he said carefully, "I'm going to need you to hand that book over. There's law for this sort of thing." She shook her head. "Law? The law here belongs to Elias Crow. You all do." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Careful what you're implying." But Clara saw it, the flicker of guilt behind his words. The truth was already breaking him from the inside. She opened the ledger and began reading names aloud. Samuel Greaves, Amos Dalton, Caleb West. One by one she spoke them into the wind, each name a wound reopening, each word a nail in the coffin of the town's silence. And then came a sound, slow, steady hooves approaching. Elias Crow rode down Main Street. Black horse beneath him, coat flaring in the wind like a shadow come to life. The townsfolk parted as he passed, eyes down, hearts pounding. He stopped before the church steps, looking up at the woman who bore his name and his secret. Clara, he said, voice calm as the grave. Come down, she didn't move. You gave me that key, Elias. You wanted me to see the truth. Now I'm giving it back to you, and to them. Elias's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze softened. You think you're saving them, but you're not. You're only trading one kind of silence for another. I'm ending yours, she said. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. The townspeople stood frozen, torn between fear and shame. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rose. He took my land, someone shouted. Another followed. He took my brother. Soon a dozen voices shouted at once, anger and grief spilling like blood in the street. Elias Crow dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the dust of his own empire. He walked toward Clara, unarmed. The crowd watched, silent now, waiting for the next move. When he reached her, he said quietly, If you open every grave, you'll have no town left to bury them in. Clara looked him in the eye. Then maybe it's time Eden Hollow learned to live without graves. She turned to the crowd and dropped the ledger at Elias's feet. This, she said, is your inheritance. The wind caught the pages, scattering them across the street, names, numbers, and debts flying like ghosts over the town. And for the first time, the people of Eden Hollow didn't look away. That night, flames rose over the valley. The townsfolk, driven by guilt and fury, rode out to Crow Ranch. The house that had stood untouched for decades now burned like judgment itself. From the hills, Clara watched in silence. Ruth stood beside her, tears streaking her face. You've doomed us all, she whispered. Clara's voice was soft, almost kind. No, I freed us. But even as she said it, her heart trembled, because freedom, like truth, came with a cost she hadn't yet seen. The fire began just before midnight. It started as a whisper, a single trail of smoke curling up from the old barn. And by the time the moon reached its highest point, Crow Ranch was a mountain of flame. The wind carried sparks across the valley, lighting the fences like dry fuses, until the land itself seemed to breathe fire. Clara watched from the ridge. Her dress whipped in the wind, her eyes glowing in the orange light. The people of Eden Hollow had come, torches in hand, not as an army, but as a reckoning. The town Elias Crow built was burning, and every man who once kept his silence was now screaming his guilt into the night. The fire roared, but beneath its sound was something quieter, almost holy, the breaking of chains no one could see. At dawn, nothing remained but smoke and bones of timber. The mansion that had loomed over the valley like a monument to power was gone. The walls collapsed. The portrait frames melted. The floorboards turned to dust. Clara walked through what was left of it, each step crunching over embers and memory. The grand staircase where she'd first stood as a bride was now a pile of blackened stone. The chandelier that had once sparkled over their silent dinners lay shattered in the dirt. And in the center of it all, near the hearth that had somehow survived the collapse, she found the iron key, the one Elias had given her on their wedding night. It was twisted and scorched, the metal warped from the heat. She picked it up, holding it in the morning light, and whispered, "It's over." But the wind, soft and unsteady, seemed to answer, "Not yet." Down by the river, she found him. Elias Crow sat alone on a fallen tree trunk, his coat draped over his shoulders, his hat resting in the mud. The fire's reflection still burned faintly in his gray eyes. He didn't look surprised to see her. "I wondered when you'd come," he said. His voice was quiet, brittle, like the last plank of a bridge giving way. "I came to see if you were alive. Clara replied. He gave a small, humorless laugh. Alive is a word men like me don't get to use twice. She stepped closer. The town burned your house. They destroyed everything. Elias nodded slowly. Good. It should have burned a long time ago. I built it on lies and debt and blood. Every stone screamed to be turned to ash. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, edges singed. I knew this day would come, he said. You think I didn't? You were the last part of me that wasn't rotten. I just wanted you close enough to see what real power does to a man before it killed me. Clara stared at him, her voice shaking. You used me? I did, Elias said softly. And I hated myself for it every day. She knelt beside him. The morning light stretched across the river, painting everything gold and gray. What's in the letter? She asked. My will, he said. Everything I have left. The land, what's worth saving. It's yours. Not because I want forgiveness, but because you'll use it differently. I don't want your empire, she said. It's poisoned. Then bury it, he replied. Bury it deep. Make something new out of what's left. He looked at her. Really looked, as if memorizing the shape of her face, the defiance in her eyes. Do you remember what I said that first night? That the truth would silence the town? Clara nodded. I was wrong, he said. You weren't meant to be silenced. You were meant to speak, even if it burned everything. Hours passed before Elias finally stood. He put his hat back on and turned toward the west, toward the endless red horizon. Where will you go? Clara asked. He smiled faintly. Somewhere the world's still cruel enough for a man like me. Don't follow. I wouldn't, she said. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt almost like farewell, almost like forgiveness, and rode off into the wind. No one saw him again. Some say he died crossing the desert. Others say he built another house somewhere no one would ever find. But Clara never believed in endings that simple. Weeks turned into months. Eden Hollow changed, slowly, painfully, beautifully. The townsfolk rebuilt what they'd destroyed, but this time they built with their own hands. The schoolhouse rose first, then the church. No one used crow money again. They worked until their palms bled, until they could look at the land and say, this is ours now. Clara became something they hadn't seen before, not a widow, not a victim, not a ghost. She became a keeper of stories. She reopened the ranch's gates, not to cattle, but to children. Orphans, drifters, the lost. The place that once hid graves now grew gardens, and every spring, she would walk to the river where Elias had sat, plant wildflowers along the bank and whisper, the fire's gone. Elias, the truth stayed. Years later, travelers passing through would still ask about the woman who lived alone by the ruins. She was 19 when she married him, the locals would say. The richest man in the West. Folks thought she'd vanished after the fire. But she's still here, keeping his ghost company, turning the land he cursed into something living. At sunset, the valley glowed again, not from fire, but from fields of gold. Wheat and lavender swaying in the wind, covering the scars like mercy. And in the distance, if you listened close, you could almost hear the echo of a horse's hooves, fading west, where the sun never tells secrets, and no truth needs to hide again. The ashes of Eden Hollow didn't mark the end. They marked the moment silence finally learned to speak.